Before I begin, I need to share with you a dread that I have had over the course of this week. We began this week in Baltimore without power from Hurricane Sandy, and our house, whenever there's a storm, loses power. And we lost power Monday morning and got it back just before last weekend. But it was cold. It was in the 40s, which is cold for us even in November. And I was looking at the weather in Abilene, both the weather then and the weather projected for now, and started to worry when I saw 75, 82 degrees, stuff like that. And I realized, if they're expecting me to wear a tie and a coat, I'm going to be really uncomfortable. And Jeff has assured me that the tie was completely optional and that the coat, actually, I've got to take it off because I'm already warm. So I thank you for your informality and appreciate that. It's a great honor for me to have been invited to give the Carmichael-Walling Lectures for this year. When I look at the names of those people who've preceded me, I find myself in some pretty rarefied scholarly company. And that's great for me. It is a real and genuine honor. I'm afraid for you, these lectures may bring home a very hard truth. The commitment to put on an annual lecture series means that eventually you will have skimmed off all the cream in the bucket. I hope that there will be sufficient richness in what I have to say to you today that although you've already collected a lot of cream from the bucket of biblical scholarship, you won't think you're now down to fat-free milk. I want to begin by saying a few words about my professional context. That's shaped me as a scholar in ways I'm still learning to appreciate, and it will come to play a role in some of the things I say today. I am by training a biblical scholar, and Paul is my specialty. But for the past 24 years, I've been a member of the theology department at Loyola. 4 of the 28 Jesuit colleges and universities in this country bear the name of Ignatius of Loyola in some form. Loyola in Baltimore is just a little bit smaller than ACU. And like you, we have a fairly comprehensive core curriculum. All of our students must take Introduction to Theology, no matter what the major. Every student who graduates from Loyola takes Introduction to Theology, as well as some other theology courses. We call it TH201. And for the past 30 years or more, we've had a commitment in our department that every full-time faculty member teaches that course. Biblical scholars, medievalists, philosophical theologians, and we have all of those and others too. Nobody escapes. Everybody teaches this. Although we have the freedom to teach to our strengths, there's no getting around the fact that we also have to stretch and teach things pretty far outside our graduate training and certainly outside our spheres of scholarly expertise. Flannery O'Connor, Dorothy Day, Catherine of Siena, Gregory of Nyssa are just some of the theologians whose works I've had to learn in the course of teaching at Loyola. And it's not always easy to do this, but it's convinced me of 2 very important things that are crucial to what I want to say today. The first is that it is impossible to do theology apart from community. In particular, it's impossible, given our current configuration of graduate training, to become a theological interpreter of Scripture apart from a vibrant community of theologians. Let me give you some practical or a practical example of this. Every day for the 24 years I've been at Loyola, members of the department gather around a table in the common area of our department for lunch. It's completely voluntary. Not everybody's there every day. People come and go as they need to. And we don't always talk about theology. But day in and day out, as often as not, someone will come to lunch having just taught a text that was new to them or just about to go teach a text that's new to them. And as they eat lunch, they can partake of the expertise of those who have taught those texts or have studied those texts, or just the collective wisdom of what it's like to teach that text to our students over a number of years. And quite simply, our curriculum doesn't work without our daily lunches. More personally, I would not be the theologian I am today apart from those lunches. Now, of course, one of the questions we ask ourselves when we hire someone is, can we imagine eating lunch with this person for the next 20 to 30 years? And that's not primarily a question about table manners, right? Is this a person who's going to add something to our conversation? Is this a person who wants to learn from us? And that's what I mean when I say really theological interpretation requires a community of vibrant theologians. The second point is more related, more directly related at least, to what I want to say today. That is, despite what I thought when I finished my PhD, the rich tradition of Christian theology from the patristic period down to the present is soaked in Scripture, even if it's sometimes hard to recognize. In fact, for the great majority of the church's history, you could not really be counted as a theologian if you were not a master of the sacred page, if you did not have a deep knowledge and sharp facility with Scripture and its interpretation. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that at its best, and of course we're not always at our best, throughout its history, theology has always been a mode of scriptural exegesis. Now, you don't have to be an expert to see that biblical interpretation during the patristic or the medieval or the early modern periods looks very, very different from the biblical interpretation I was trained to do in graduate school. One way of accounting for this difference, the way I think I was at least implicitly, if not explicitly, taught, was that pre-modern biblical interpretation was simply a form of error. Just as physics moved on from debates about phlogiston in the 17th century, we biblical scholars have left those failed interpretive remains behind. I understand how this argument works in physics. Theories about phlogiston were replaced by theories about oxygen. And those superior theories accounted both for the data that had been observed and allowed scientists reliably to anticipate future data. Theories about oxygen did the same job, answered the same questions that theories about phlogiston did, and did so better, and with fewer residual difficulties and anomalies. It's just a lot harder to make this case with scriptural interpretation over time. That is, it's harder to claim that modern biblical criticism is a clear advance over pre-modern biblical criticism. One way of making that claim, I suppose, is to say that modern biblical criticism leads readers to the meaning of biblical texts better than pre-modern biblical criticism did. By mastering a number of ancient languages and some modern scholarly languages, by studying the histories, cultures, and societies within which the biblical texts are set and within which the biblical texts were produced, and most importantly, by developing a facility with a number of critical skills that are often lumped together under the name historical criticism, one will be able to uncover the meaning of biblical texts in ways pre-modern biblical interpreters did not and really could not do. Although I don't recall anyone ever saying it to me quite that sharply as I just did, that was certainly a widely assumed view when I was beginning my graduate training in biblical studies in the early 1980s. In the intervening time, a number of things have rendered this account implausible to me and to many others. First, many of the practices of historical criticism were shown to be badly flawed in their assumptions and in their methods. The best example of this is gospel form criticism. The assumptions about the transition from oral to written exposition and about the ways language functions in different contexts that made gospel form criticism work have been demonstrated to be misguided and badly so. This change isn't in itself surprising. Gospel form criticism was the methodical working out of theories. In the course of investigating those theories, they proved to be inadequate. That's how knowledge is tested and developed in any field. The failure of gospel form criticism is not in and of itself a problem if it's replaced by new theories and methods that can do the same things better just as theories about oxygen replaced theories about phlogiston. It's not clear to me, however, that such a theory has emerged. Further, it became clear that the other various practices that went under the name historical criticism didn't actually work together to produce a single result called meaning. The more proficient we became at these various practices, the clearer it became that their results were not really compatible with each other. Now, that's not to say that the results of any of those practices were false. Rather, it meant that the results could rarely, if ever, be combined into one summative result called the meaning of a biblical text. Now, when you add to that situation the advent of new critical practices that were entering biblical studies from such fields as classics, history, literature, and sociology, the beginning graduate students' hope of finding the meaning of the biblical text became ever more remote. Finally, and maybe most importantly, those working in fields such as philosophical hermeneutics began to show us that the meaning of a text was a lot more complex than we once thought. Initially, there was great resistance to addressing these philosophical concerns. If the practices of historical criticism had been as internally cohesive and coherent as was once thought, arguments about meaning might have been kept at arm's length. That's just what philosophical people are interested in. But in the absence of such cohesion, and in the presence of newer critical practices, the questions about the nature of textual meaning were too pervasive, too compelling, and too important simply to ignore. Arguments among biblical scholars about the meaning of a text became very intense. And that intensity remains and often grows whenever someone has a stake in claiming that the meaning of the biblical text is simply one thing and everything else is either error or subsidiary or derivative. This isn't simply a scholarly phenomenon either. If you've ever been part of a group Bible study, you've probably encountered this issue. Indeed, it appears that whole churches often divide over matters of biblical interpretation. The institutions that support biblical scholarship have, for the most part, not directly confronted these intense arguments. Instead, they simply allow a variety of interpretive interests and approaches to each have their own space. This doesn't resolve any of the serious theoretical issues, but it allows us all to operate in the absence of any coherent way of resolving the various challenges to historical criticism that I noted above. Now, that's not to say that the intensity of the arguments over historical criticism and its alternatives have completely dissipated. Rather, it simply means that these arguments are now generally carried out by discrete groups arguing with themselves. I take it that despite its own inner tensions, arguments over historical criticism and the subsequent fragmentation of biblical scholarship into numerous discrete interests are, at their root, very specific examples of the larger failure of arguments about textual meaning that one finds in other disciplines. One can still pursue a grand, unified theory of textual meaning and methods for attaining or displaying it, but I'm just not optimistic for success here. Although some might consider this a crisis, for those who are interested, as I am, in reinvigorating forms of biblical interpretation that are genuinely theological, this fragmented state of affairs is more like an opportunity. Although Christians have always read Scripture theologically, within the guild of professional biblical scholars, these practices had largely fallen out of favor with the rise of historical criticism beginning in the 18th century, or at least at the end of the 18th century. By the time of the methodological ascendance of historical criticism, its practices were often seen as the only viable scholarly option, and they largely worked to keep theological considerations at arm's length. Whereas in pre-modern times, one could not be counted a theologian unless one was a master of the sacred page. By the time of historical criticism's ascendancy, one could either be a theologian or a biblical scholar, but not both. And this disjunction persists down to today and is rigidly enforced in the structure of many graduate school curricula. As I already mentioned, however, the fragmentation of biblical scholarship has provided an opportunity to reinvigorate the practices of theological interpretation. Since no one set of interpretive considerations can guarantee access to textual meaning, it becomes difficult to deny a place to most thoughtful forms of interpreting Scripture. Theological considerations can no longer be ruled out of court simply for being theological. And the past 20 years have witnessed a significant growth in scholarship directed towards what might be called theological interpretation of Scripture. There are at least 2 large commentary series devoted to this. There is a journal whose title is Journal for the Theological Interpretation of Scripture. There are lots of groups at the Society of Biblical Literature who are devoted to this now. It's a healthy enterprise. It would be foolish, though, to say that theological interpretation of Scripture is now the dominant mode of biblical interpretation within the academy. It's not. I think it is safe to say that theological interpretation has sufficient support among scholars and the institutions that support them that it seems set to continue as a distinct scholarly activity for some time to come. And in the time I have remaining with you this afternoon, I want to set out 3 separate issues facing theological interpretation of Scripture as they move forward into the future. The first of these issues concerns debates around the nature and practice of theological interpretation. That'll be relatively short. These debates are largely matters of self-definition, and I've spent a good deal of time writing about this already, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing so here. That's not because I assume you have all committed my work to memory, though that would be a nice gesture on your part. Rather, I just don't think there's a lot to say about this. The second concerns the relationships between theological interpretation and other practices of biblical scholarship, particularly those that go under the name historical criticism. When theological interpretation of Scripture was trying to get a foothold in the academy, there was a good deal of overheated rhetoric, both from theological interpreters and historical critics, about either the necessity or the bankrupt nature of historical criticism. I think the time is right both to reflect on these relationships and to reflect on them in less fevered tones. Finally, in recent years, it seemed to me that many of the debates and arguments I have had with other theological interpreters over the years have as much to do with our differing ecclesial locations as they do with our differing methodological perspectives. This is something I'm only slowly beginning to reflect on, and tonight's lecture will take up some of the early stages of that reflection. So, I've given you a bit of a historical précis, a roadmap of where we're going. It's now time to get moving. Many new academic ventures are marked by extraordinary methodological self-consciousness and great fussiness over self-definition and boundary marking. Theological interpretation of Scripture was not different in this respect. Although theological interpretation of Scripture was new to the modern university, it wasn't a new practice. Rather than starting something new, I've always tried to speak in terms of reviving something older, a practice, or maybe even better, a set of practices that used to be considered normal, but had largely been eclipsed. Clearly, no one should repristinate or fantasize about the past and then seek to repeat slavishly something that never was. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the aims of contemporary scholars interested in theological interpretation should be directed to discerning and reflecting on the habits and practices of those pre-modern interpreters who saw scriptural interpretation as one of the central tasks of theology, not as a separate, distinct discipline from theology. Those habits and practices would need to be made serviceable for our modern contexts and related to other interpretive habits and contexts. But this does not and did not require a distinct interpretive method for theological interpretation. In this regard, I think it's striking to note that unlike our own time, pre-modern interpreters produced very few works of interpretive method. Origen's On First Principles, Augustine's On Christian Doctrine come immediately to mind. In addition, I suppose in the medieval period, you have Nicholas of Lyra and Thomas Aquinas write what might be called methodological reflections. And one can learn much from the debates between Erasmus and Luther or Calvin and Sadoleto, and there are no doubt others besides these that come immediately to your mind. Nevertheless, in comparison with the modern period, there are very few works dedicated to what might be called interpretive method. I think that despite their obvious and manifold differences, Origen, Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther, for example, all share an approach that does not treat scriptural interpretation as an end in itself. Instead, what they all seem to share in their own various ways is a view that Scripture is to be interpreted in the light of the larger ends of the Christian life. They use different idioms to describe this. Some invoke the vocabulary of salvation. Others speak of ever deeper love of God and neighbor, or ever deeper union with the triune God, or deeper friendship with God. And these differing vocabularies can lead one to think that there are many different views about the end of the Christian life. But that would be a mistake. There's enormous agreement on this matter. No one of these idioms rules out the other. Moreover, given the fact that there is an inbuilt element of mystery about the precise nature of our ultimate end in God, it's not surprising to find a variety of ways of describing this. Nevertheless, by focusing on the end or the purpose of the Christian life, one can see that scriptural interpretation is never an end in and of itself. Scripture becomes the primary gift of God for drawing us toward our ultimate end, but it's that end that's important. Scripture has a role to play in the divine drama of salvation. To use Augustine's image, which I have not come across a better one, is that Scripture becomes the vehicle on which we ride toward our true home along the road laid down by Christ. Reading Scripture theologically, then, involves those habits and practices that will enable us to interpret Scripture in ways that will enhance rather than frustrate our progress toward our ultimate end in God. Now, I recognize that that's a pretty open-ended account of theological interpretation. That it is so is not simply a factor of the time constraints on this lecture having been cut down from 4 to 1 hour. I also think that there's little to gain and much to be lost by trying to offer too narrow a definition of theological interpretation. In fact, I would be very happy for all to adopt the view that theological interpretation is that interpretation that keeps theological concerns primary. Keeping theological concerns primary means that Scripture and/or scriptural interpretation doesn't become a source, a tool, a means to attain some other goal or project that's not theological, that is not serving the ends of ever more faithful faith and practice, so that Christians might be drawn into deeper love of God and neighbor. Although a definition as broad as this is capable of bringing rigorous scholarly forms of biblical study, as well as sermons and homilies and congregational Bible studies, all under the umbrella of theological interpretation, I'm primarily interested here today with scholarly forms of interpretation. It's here where I would like to chart out some of the relationships between theological interpretation of Scripture and some of the other types of biblical interpretation common in the academy. In my narration of the rise of contemporary interest in theological interpretation, I hinted that when theological interests were trying to assert themselves into the scholarly mainstream, the advocates for theological interpretation often made overheated claims about the bankruptcy of historical criticism. At the same time, there's also been an outpouring of articles by scholars arguing that allowing theological concerns a hearing within such institutions as the Society of Biblical Literature will have a deleterious effect on biblical scholarship. These two tend to rely on overheated claims about such things as scholarly objectivity, historical integrity, and so forth. Often, each side points to poorly executed or poorly defended examples of whatever it is they're arguing against. This seems to be not so much an argument in favor of one sort of interpretation over another, as an argument in favor of doing whatever work one does better. As long as each side continues to make overheated claims about the logical necessity of their approach relative to all others, we can expect a lot of rhetorical heat and very little hermeneutical light. For those of us who are both interested in theological interpretation and recognize at the same time the legitimacy of other interpretive interests and practices, the question remains, how should theological interpreters engage other forms of biblical criticism? The short answer is theological interpreters can and should make use of historical, literary, social scientific, and all other types of biblical interpretation as long as they understand that such work needs to be subsidiary to the task of keeping theological concerns primary. Scholars can and will interpret biblical texts from a variety of interpretive interests, employing diverse interpretive practices. They can and will offer these interpretations as ends in themselves, or contributions to larger historical, literary, or social scientific projects, and that's all to the good. Theological interpreters should read, engage, and learn from such works. This is because theological interpreters can and should make use of them when and as they can help the tasks of theological interpretation. The practice of engaging and making use of the best work of those who don't share one's theological convictions has a long history in the Church. Origen, for example, argued for a deep and thoughtful engagement with pagan philosophy to the extent that it helped Christians think about Christianity better. He used the trope of the Israelites plundering the Egyptians in Exodus to justify this practice, and many have followed in his footsteps. Saying this, however, raises a number of other questions. I'll try to answer some of these now, and then also try to touch on one larger question, but say more about it tonight. So far, I've argued that theological interpretation of Scripture is marked by a sustained interpretive commitment to keep theological concerns primary in one's interpretation. At the forefront of this is the desire to interpret Scripture in ways that will enhance Christians' progress to ever deeper love of God and neighbor. In the course of this, theological interpreters can and should make ad hoc use of other interpretive habits, practices, and results. This raises the question of how to make such ad hoc use of other interpretive habits, practices, and results without sacrificing the primacy of theological concerns. It probably won't come as a huge surprise to learn that I don't think there's a single method that guarantees success here. But just because there's not a method does not mean we can't think methodically about these questions and come up with some insights. I want to suggest that rather than pursuing a method to keep all of the various interpretive interests of biblical scholars in some sort of proper order, theological interpreters would be better served by working to cultivate a set of interpretive virtues that will help them make wise judgments about how to keep theological concerns primary in their interpretive work. I would also like to suggest that the formation of any virtue, interpretive or otherwise, requires institutional contexts that will nurture such virtue, particularly in younger scholars. And in this light, I'll conclude with some reflections on the place of a church-related university in this process. First, although I'm certain that theological interpreters of Scripture should cultivate numerous virtues, both moral and intellectual, two in particular come to the forefront. I'm going to talk about these two, but by no means think that this is the whole list. These two are charity and then prudence, or practical reason. At their best, these two virtues work together to help theological interpreters engage the wide variety of biblical interpretation while working to maintain the primacy of theological concerns. I say this to remind us that although I will speak of each of these virtues as if they were discrete, they ultimately must be manifested together, along with, of course, other virtues, and manifested in a more or less unified human life. So although I'm going to talk about them as sort of discrete pieces, there's no real way to embody them discretely. They get embodied together. They are cultivated hand in hand with each other, along with a variety of other virtues. So first, charity. Charity in interpretation is always directed toward maximizing agreement between interpreters. The point of this is not to reduce disagreement because disagreements are bad and upsetting. Rather, charity assumes that if interpreters read each other's works in ways that maximize their agreements, then both the nature and the scope of their disagreements will be clearer and more capable of resolution. Such charity is particularly important when dealing with interpreters and interpretations that come from times, places, and cultures far different from our own. When we seek to maximize the agreements between ourselves and such interpreters, we reduce the temptation simply to make those interpreters inferior versions of ourselves who can be easily dismissed. In this respect, when historical critics emphasize the temporal and cultural strangeness of the Bible, they are emphasizing a necessary but not a sufficient aspect of interpretive charity. They see the importance of understanding interpreters and interpretations on their own terms. So that's one of the great skills you learn in the course of sort of being inculcated into the practices of historical criticism. It is necessary but not sufficient, though, for charity. And it's necessary but not sufficient because the charitable interpreter will not simply desire to display the strangeness of alternative views. In addition, the charitable interpreter will want to present alternative interpreters and interpretations in the most positive light possible. And this might require going above and beyond the work done by those who hold those alternative views. You may involve doing more for your argumentative opponents than they did for themselves. Nevertheless, if you're to produce a better interpretive alternative, then you've got to build upon and extend the strengths of that alternative's view without replicating their weaknesses. And the only way you can do that is if you present that alternative in its strongest possible form. And you may need to do that even if the person you're engaging didn't do that. It should be clear from this discussion of charity that charity is not about artificial forms of humility. It doesn't require one to support weak or erroneous interpretations in favor of keeping interpretive peace. There is no reason for charitable interpreters to shy away from disagreement or argument. Indeed, until that time, when God's law is written directly on our hearts, Christians can expect that disagreements and debate will mark all of our engagements with Scripture. In such a situation, charity is that virtue which will give us the best chance of resolving our disputes well. The second virtue I want to discuss is practical reason or prudence. If you were to pick up a journal in the field of biblical studies or attend a professional conference like many of us will be doing next week, a professional conference of biblical scholars, at least two things would strike you. First, the material under discussion is both exceedingly diverse and complex. Secondly, those who are fully participating in the discussions and debates are able to address this complexity and diversity relatively well. What I mean is they're able to figure out where the critical issues lie. They can make judgments about the weight and relevance of particular claims. They can come to a conclusion which they can defend, revise, or abandon in the light of new evidence or superior arguments. What this shows in part is these scholars have been more or less well-formed to be particular sorts of readers or interpreters. It is simply the case that you cannot successfully and proficiently enter into these professional discussions and debates without prior formation. As some of you know, and the rest of you may guess, this is in part because there's a great deal of technical information to master. But that's not the whole story. This technical information is not self-interpreting. It does not organize itself. It cannot identify its own problems and tensions and underlying patterns. Professional proficiency presumes technical mastery, but such professional proficiency is distinguished from technical mastery by the professional's abilities to engage in interpretive debates, discussions, and to reformulate the issues as needed, to marshal evidence, both arguing for its relevance to a particular issue and showing how that evidence should lead to specific conclusions, to defend, refine, and reformulate views in the light of counterclaims, and in all of this, advance a particular interpretive debate or discussion. The virtue then enables one to move beyond technical mastery to professional proficiency is what Aristotle would call phronesis, or practical reasoning, or prudence. Although it's rarely specified in this way, the graduate formation of biblical scholars is primarily an exercise in cultivating the virtue of practical reasoning. The aim of this is so that scholars can deploy their technical knowledge and skills in ways that are appropriate to specific problems, contexts, and audiences. The prudent or practically wise scholar perceives the relevant similarities between complex problems and already agreed upon standards, and then moves, largely by analogy, to use already proven standards to elucidate the unknown. Given that theological interpretation of Scripture is marked by debates, discussions, and arguments about how to interpret and embody Scripture so as to enhance Christians' prospects of worshiping and living faithfully before God, cultivating the virtue of practical reasoning or prudence will be as important as cultivating the virtue of interpretive charity. This is so that the technical skills and knowledge of the scholar can fruitfully be displayed, deployed, and directed toward the larger ends of the Christian life. Without practical reasoning, it's too easy to displace theological concerns from their primacy in theological interpretation. How are such virtues formed and cultivated in people? The Academy has relatively clear ways of doing this for professional biblical scholars, and it does so pretty well. theological interpreters of Scripture can benefit from such formation. I should also say, however, that the Academy is weakest in developing both the technical skills and knowledge attendant to theological interpretation and the precise ways in which one needs to be formed in order to be a charitable and prudent theological interpreter. In large part, this is because the skills and knowledge distinctively related to theological interpretation cross the disciplinary and departmental boundaries that shape most institutions. There is much work to be done here with regard to the curricula and aims of graduate education that will develop theological interpreters of Scripture. Historical and systematic theologians will need to work with biblical scholars and others in ways that graduate training does not equip them well to do. Remember my initial remarks about our departmental lunch table. It's there that the boundaries that graduate programs do so much to build are gradually torn down over time. In addition, we must not forget that the aims of theological interpretation will always have an eye on the church, on that primary context where Christians argue, debate, and discuss Scripture with the aim of deepening their love of God and neighbor. Having said that, I think I can assert to you all, without much argument, that in regard to both of these virtues that are crucial to theological interpretation, the Academy does a much better job than the Church in cultivating charitable and prudent interpreters. In noting that, I'm not planning to start ranting about the various pathologies of ecclesial life that make it difficult for churches to form wise readers of Scripture. There may be a place for such ranting, but I don't think it's here among people I've just met. Instead, I simply want to indicate that the Academy seeks to form a relatively select group of readers. The Church seeks to form all members of Christ's body. In the Academy, failure in formation means that you simply are excluded from the Academy. Hardly a fate worse than death. In the Church, we tend not to exclude those who don't measure up because we know that we too often fail to measure up. All of this is simply to note that the Academy and the Church have different missions. And this, I think, more than anything else, accounts for the Academy's success at forming theological interpreters. This difference between Academy and Church when it comes to forming theological interpreters, leads me to a concluding point, though. That is, there is, perhaps now more than ever, a need for institutions within which theological interpreters of Scripture can be formed in ways that both impart the requisite technical mastery of languages, history, philosophy, and doctrine, and such interpretive virtues as charity and prudence and all the others that might go along with this. Within such institutions, one would expect to find such things as exemplary teaching offered by a faculty of Christian scholars that inspires a commitment to learning. You'd also expect to find significant research grounded in the university's disciplines of studies that informs issues of importance to the Academy, to the Church, and to society. You would also expect to find that that institution would be engaged in meaningful service to society, to the academic disciplines, to the university, and the Church. Those of you who are particularly alert at this point will recognize that I have merely lifted 3 crucial characteristics from your mission statement. I do that not simply to commend the university, and having a trustee here, particular kudos to you, I guess, for such a clear and robust statement, but it allows me to make a strong plea here for the continuing life of the church-related college and university. The formation of theological interpreters of Scripture that are masterful, charitable, and prudent would seem to flourish best in these sorts of environments. As both an alumnus of one such institution and as a faculty member at another, I am utterly convinced of this. At the same time, this raises an interesting set of concerns that I'll simply note here in closing and then take up more fully tonight. Yours is not simply a church-related university. It is a university related to a particular tradition of Christianity. This is neither my own tradition nor the tradition of the place where I teach. And what this begins to suggest, and what I think to be the case, is that theological interpreters of Scripture are formed within distinct traditions and contexts of Christianity. The differences between those traditions and contexts will begin to manifest themselves in their scriptural interpretation. So the more a place like ACU or Loyola or Wheaton flourishes and forms theological interpreters, the more you should also expect to see that the ecclesial differences of each institution begin to manifest themselves in the specific forms of theological interpretation that people formed within those institutions produce. As I think about my companions in this enterprise of theological interpretation and some of the disagreements that we've had over the years, I'm convinced that although we thought we were disagreeing over matters of method, a large chunk of our disagreement was related to the different branches of the church in which we were formed. All of that indicates to me that one of the pressing tasks facing theological interpreters in the present has to do with focusing our attention on the divided state of the church and its implications. But that's tonight's lecture. Thank you.